Benn Proctor is a program associate with the Wilson Center's Canada Institute. Previously, he was a senior regulatory analyst at the Alberta Energy Regulator, a policy analyst for British Columbia Utilities Commission, and a researcher at the Bank of Canada. Ben joins us to discuss latest trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada, particularly over dairy products. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So there's always some level of trade tension between the U.S. and Canada. Why a flare-up now over dairy?
Well, yeah, and that's a good question. I think partly that goes to show sort of the strength of the Canada-U.S. relationship. That kind of our biggest issues are, do we subsidize our lumber, or are we buying enough U.S. dairy products? So it is, on the whole, a very good trade relationship. But the key thing to know about Canadian dairy is prices domestically are appallingly high in Canada. So it's always a prize for foreign countries who are negotiating trade agreements with Canada. So U.S. farmers want access to the Canadian dairy market because it's a lucrative market to get into. And so with the NAFTA renegotiations, coupled with some strategic choices made by Canadian dairy farmers that have hurt U.S. dairy farmers, it's become a big political issue.
So, depending on who you're reading or what you're reading right now, you could see that President Trump is unfairly picking on a close ally, or Canada's engaged in really unfair protectionist trade policies. Where does the truth lie between those two?
It lies right in the middle of that, unfortunately. But I wish I could say it's black or white. So President Trump has tweeted about the high tariffs that Canadians charge to U.S. dairy. And sometimes on butter, it gets up to a 300% tax on U.S. butter. So that butter never makes it into Canada because no one's willing to pay that. But there is about 10% of the Canadian dairy market that's supplied by foreign producers, and the U.S. under NAFTA has a lot of access commitments where they're allowed to enter their dairy products into Canada without paying a tariff charge. So the U.S. has a trade surplus in dairy trade with Canada of around 400 to 500 million. So they do have some access, but at the same point, they'd like more. And actually, it'd be beneficial for Canadians to consider granting more because the U.S. Can produce it at a lower cost.
So, to bring down prices for consumers. That's
yeah.
the advantage for Canada?
Yeah, and so there's two sort of things to know about Canadian dairy. On the domestic front, prices are anywhere between 40 to 80% higher than world prices, and that's because the Canadian system of supply management prevents or forbids new entrants new Canadians from starting up dairy farms without spending millions of dollars on basically permits, which grant you the right to produce dairy in Canada. So if you wanted to start up a farm in Canada, maybe buy 108 cattle, you first need to acquire permits, and that would cost you about $4 million to kind of start a farm that has 110 cows on it. Mm-hmm. And that's in addition to then having to buy the cows and get the barn. So it's quite a protected system, and it's been estimated, for a gallon of milk, it's about $1.50 more that Canadians pay than Americans. That adds up when you think about how much milk they buy.
What do they get for that, though, Ben? In other words, they're not just doing this to keep the cost of a gallon of milk high, right? There's some rationale behind what benefit Canada accrues from this system.
Unfortunately, I think the rationale is that they're trying to keep the price of milk high, and dairy farmers...
Toward what end?
Toward the end of winning seats in the Canadian election. So much like
it's a political issue.
Yeah, it's a political capture issue. And so much like in the U.S., where the ethanol issue becomes big when the Iowa primaries roll in, or U.S. has a sugar tariff. So everyone has these sensitive sectors. In Canada, dairy farms are concentrated in Quebec and Ontario in a few ridings. So your position on dairy farms on the system of supply management could make or break in an election campaign. And you see across the board from right wing to left of center, all parties kind of support the existing system. Yeah, and it's really just about capturing votes from the dairy farmers.
Well, if I have this right, the quota system kicks in after a certain amount, or the tariff system kicks in after a certain amount, correct?
Yeah.
And so is the U.S. goal to just make the quotas higher, or just eliminate them altogether?
Well, the U.S. has two goals, and they've asked for in their negotiating objectives, changes to the system of supply management. At the same point, Sonny Perdue was in Prince Edward Island, and he said, look, we don't want to, wholesale changes to the system. They're actually more concerned about this new policy that Canadians have adopted called, it's a national pricing strategy. And what that pricing strategy has done, it's priced out imports that were coming from the U.S. So the U.S. was sending a lot of Dyer filtered milk. It's actually a really innovative product that U.S. farmers created to get around Canadian tariff laws. Canada has made some changes to prevent that from coming in. And in addition, Canadian farmers are now starting to export more powder on the global market. And so that's depressed prices. So U.S. farmers are feeling a double whammy in that they've lost imports to Canada, and additionally, they're now seeing price declines on the global market because of Canadian dairy actions.
It's also my understanding that if the U.S. had stayed in TPP, this would be a moot point because these tariffs would have been eliminated.
Yeah.
Is it now being rolled into NAFTA?
I would say it wouldn't be a moot point, but Canada did grant some access in the TPP, about 3.5% commitment in terms of increasing the quantity of dairy products that would enter tariff-free. Mm-hmm. So in every trade negotiation, Canada offers up a little access. In their agreement with the European Union, I think 17,000 tons of cheese are now allowed to come in tariff-free. So Canadians kind of gleefully point out, they say, well, U.S., if you wanted dairy market access, you should have stayed in the TPP. But I don't know that that's a strong enough reason to say we shouldn't allow U.S. dairy to increase in the NAFTA negotiations, because actually Canada would benefit from it. It's just an issue of political capture.
Do we know how prominent these things are in the NAFTA negotiations, or are we just assuming?
Well, Canada has 5 red line issues, and a lot of their red line issues make sense. They don't want a sunset clause in the NAFTA negotiation. It's a perfectly legitimate complaint to have. But one of their issues they've sort of floated as maybe not a red line, but call it a yellow light, is dairy market access. And that's because the current Liberal government knows that if they're seen to concede more dairy market access to the U.S., that could hurt their ability to capture ridings and seats in Quebec and Ontario.
And you talk about the politics of it. This letter that was sent to Donald Trump by 2 governors whose names you don't usually see together on any document, Scott Walker of Wisconsin and Andrew Cuomo of New York. This would seem to indicate that there's no partisanship over this issue from the U.S. perspective.
Yeah, that's true. And in Wisconsin in particular, they really productive dairy farms. It's been estimated about 15% more milk per cow is produced in Wisconsin than in Canada. And so you can see why they want access to the Canadian market. Both Wisconsin and New York, for a variety of reasons, are important political battlegrounds right now. So the one thing that I'll point out, though, is even though U.S. dairy farmers want greater access to the Canadian market, there's been some benefits to the NAFTA negotiation. So Mexico is actually the largest export market for U.S. dairy. Canada's number 2. So they do have some access through the NAFTA negotiations. In fact, the retaliatory tariffs announced by Mexico just recently threatens, and I think they're in effect now, threatens a 25% tariff on U.S. cheese. So while U.S. dairy farmers would like to see access to Canada, I don't think they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Beyond any particular product or industry, does this point out a fundamental difference, and beyond the closeness of U.S. and Canada, does this illustrate a fundamental difference in approaches to capitalism between the 2 countries?
I would say I think it's granted that Canadians tolerate more how do I put it, a little more government intervention in their markets. And one of the peculiar things, though, is even if you were to look at the Conservative Party in Canada, which has pretty strong free market credentials, they're one of the strongest supporters of the dairy industry. And in fact, there's a famous clip of the leader at kind of Canada's version of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It's not as funny as that, but the parliamentary press dinner, he chugs milk, but he says, I don't owe my election to anyone, as he's drinking a big glass of milk. And so that gets some laughs, but it's odd because it's really the antithesis to a free market system. But at the same point, at the very left of Canada, the New Democrats, they also strongly support the market intervention and supply management. even though the policy is quite regressive. And it's regressive in the fact that low-income Canadians end up having to spend a lot more on dairy. So the poorest 20% of Canadians will actually spend about 2.5% of their income on supply managed goods. That includes both dairy and poultry. And so it's really about transferring wealth from consumers to the supply managed industries. And it's been estimated it's about a transfer of $3 billion. So it's quite a lot, but Canadians have been living with it for a while. So it's not odd to walk into the grocery store and pay a little more for your milk than is expected.
Final thought, Ben, and forgive me for asking you to play the speculation game, but how does this get resolved? What do you see happening? Does this escalate between Canada and the U.S. before it's resolved, or is there some way that this can come together sooner rather than later?
I think it'll be part of the negotiation process. I don't think it'll escalate, and in fact, one of the things is Canadian negotiators need someone to blame a bit for granting more access to the United States, and so President Trump is a good foil for that. I don't think the Canadian government, I think in their heart of hearts, they know they've kind of designed really bad policy in supply management, but because of the political considerations in Canada, they really need to find an out for that. So having U.S. trade go on the offensive about this might create a way, because Canadians broadly support the NAFTA, they want it kept. So there may be room for some concessions on that part.
It's amazing that with all the differences in the world, there's that one universal thing that all political movements seem to require a foil. Ben, thank you very much. This is complicated. Thanks for explaining it to us.
Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it.